Good afternoon, everybody, and you are so very welcome to the WorkEqual 2020 conference, proudly supported for the next 3 years by Permanent TSB and Solace. They are our partners in crime. We've worked very closely with them, and their support is vital to the programme of events that you are about to partake in today and through the month of November. I am the founder of Dress for Success Dublin and of WorkEqual, and the purpose of WorkEqual was to really open up a multi-stakeholder conversation about the steps, the practical steps that could help people to move faster to workplace equality. You will see in your chat function that there is a link there to the WorkEqual report, which was generated by myself and Professor Michelle Miller from NUIG as a result of last year's conference. In it, we identified the 5 pillar areas that were discussed and, I suppose, rubber stamped by attendees last year. Last year's conference was a real moment in time for us, not only because we got everybody in the room, but really because they were so much part of the output that was resulting from it. So to talk about WorkEqual, it's really a campaign to raise awareness of workplace gender inequalities and related issues, and develop solutions to address these. So when we started this campaign in 2016, we had a primary focus on the gender pay gap, and really that was a bit like a Molotov cocktail just to get people talking, and that it did. A lot of people didn't believe us at the time, but thankfully now we've raised the level of conversation and raised the level of interest and impact around this conversation to really make great strides in gender equality in the workplace. So this month's campaign is focused around a number of events, including Equal Pay Day, which this year, due to Ireland's pay gap of 14.4%, falls next Monday, the 9th of November. And to celebrate that, we will be hosting the second of our online events as part of the conference. So we will be running the Solution Series panel discussions focused on the 5 pillars that were identified at last year's conference. Permanent TSB and Solace, as I said, are headline sponsors of the WorkEqual event and are so committed to the work that we're doing that, as I said, they have committed to the next 3 years sponsorship. This is not a quick fix discussion. This is something that is going to take time. It is something that, even with the best will of the world, may see us go backwards before we go forwards. So this is around identifying how we can make real positive change to make not only pay, but also opportunities equal for women in Irish workplaces and in societies. My great pleasure now is to sit back and watch the conversation unfold. And as part of that conversation, we'll be reviewing the recommendations that are in the WorkEqual report, Practical Steps Towards Workplace Equality. And those recommendations include a review of the education curriculum to eradicate gender stereotyping, scholarship to attract more men into teaching professions, unconscious bias training, not just for teachers, but for employees, recruiters and managers, broadcasting codes of conduct. What are the messages that we're sending out to our wider society about gender stereotyping? Incentive schemes for workplace for men to take up and share unpaid caring and domestic duties. Some companies have implemented these policies, but take up is worryingly low where they exist. And finally, it was really important to us to offer policy recommendations at government level, business recommendations for people within our business sector, but also personal recommendations. And our final one there is to challenge yourself in your decision-making situations and ask, is this a fair representation of the needs of both men and women? And we've seen a lot of instances recently where that is very much lacking. So we all have a duty of care to make sure that when decisions are made, they represent everybody in society.
You're stuck.
Okay. Do you want me to kick on?
Yeah, I'll kick on. Okay, thanks for that, Sonia. And your broadband got a little bit stuck there, but I'll jump in now. My name is Mark Paul. I'll be your MC, I suppose, for the afternoon. I'm the business affairs correspondent of the Irish Times, and I'm also a columnist with the paper. And as part of that, I write a column every Friday called Caveat, and invariably in Caveat, I look at certain issues from a sort of a slightly different point of view. And gender stereotyping in the boardroom, gender stereotyping in the corporate world is an issue that I've often looked at. But sometimes really to understand an issue, you have to see it at home. And as well as being a journalist and a columnist, I'm also a father to two girls, aged 5 and 9. And whilst we're all working from home, it tends to be my job these days to get them ready and out to school and bring them to school. And this morning, actually, I was helping my 5-year-old get dressed, as I very often do. And her hair, when she wakes up in the morning, can be quite Amazonian sometimes. And I usually try and tame it in the only way that I know how, which is to pull it into a fairly perfunctory ponytail, dad style, a daddy tail, as I call it. And this morning when I went to do that, my daughter, Evelyn, said, no. She says, your ponytails are terrible. She said, only mommy can do good ponytails. And I thought to myself, that's, it may well be a statement of fact in relation to me, but it's also a gender stereotype. And so we're here today to talk about how can we banish gender stereotypes from society, or at least minimize them or reduce their impact. So we're going to hear from 3 groups of speakers. And I'll introduce them to you now, and then we'll hear from the 3 of them in turn, and then we'll do the questions afterwards. So our first speaker is actually 2 speakers, Cormac Harris and Alan O'Sullivan, who won the BT Young Scientist competition in January with a study on gender bias and gender stereotyping of 5 to 7-year-olds. Very, very remarkable thing for the BT Young Scientist competition, and they won it. And they're invariably known in media reports, as far as I can see, as the 2 lads from Cork. They're down in Colum and Ballincollig, so we'll hear from them in a moment. Then we'll hear from Professor Anne Looney, who is the Executive Dean of Dublin City University's Faculty of Education, and this is the biggest teacher training institute in the country. So Professor Looney, Anne, is in charge of teaching the teachers, I suppose, and that's really one area where gender stereotyping can be tackled. And then we'll hear, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Karen Boyle, who is the Professor of Feminist Media Studies at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and she's also an author. And last year she published a book, Me Too, Weinstein and Feminism. And then once all the presentations and the questions are over, hopefully we'll hear from a couple of minutes as well then from Professor Michelle Miller, who's the Dean of Students at NUIG, and she is an advisor, the academic advisor to the WorkEqual campaign, and she's also the rapporteur for this series of events. So before we hear from the first speakers, from Cormac and Alan, I'd just like to say to you guys, obviously, journalists, we think we have all the questions, all the best questions, but we don't. Usually it's you guys. Usually it's the people who are listening in or reading whatever it is that we're on about. So we'd like to encourage you to come forward with as many questions as you can, and don't wait until the end to do it. Send them through the Zoom chat, and the team at Alice PR and the WorkEqual campaign team, they'll collate those questions and send them through to me, and I'll put as many of them to the panelists as I can. So you can do it through Zoom, or you can do it on Twitter using the hashtag WorkEqual. And as always, we're very focused on solutions here, and we're not here to talk about how much of a problem gender stereotyping is. We know it's a problem, and we're very interested in practical solutions as to how it can be addressed. So I'll take you on to our first speakers now. So that's Cormac and Alan, the 2 lads from Cork, who are currently down in the Deputy Principal's office in Colum in Ballincollig. And Cormac and Alan, you're very welcome. And tell us a little bit about your project and in terms of gender stereotyping for young people and young girls.
Hi there. Well, to avoid any confusion before we start, my name is Cormac.
And I'm Alan. Sometimes people do get confused, so we'll just clarify that before we start. So our project was on gender stereotyping in 5 to 7-year-olds. It was titled A Statistical Investigation into the Prevalence of Gender Stereotyping in 5 to 7-year-olds and the Development of a Resource Kit to Help Combat Gender Stereotyping. So really why we decided to do the project is last year we were both in 4th year and we were thinking of what subjects we might do for our leaving cert. And we noticed that the majority of students that were picking subjects like metalwork or DCG were boys, and the majority of students picking subjects like art or home ec were girls. And we were really confused as to why this was. And it was a continuing pattern over all the time. So what we decided to do is go right back to the very start of education to see, does this gender divide between subjects exist? Because we were really intrigued to, did this exist at this age? And we were wondering, did it start at this age? But was there something happening in the education system? So we went around to 5 different schools and surveyed 376 different pupils between the ages of 5 to 7. So that was senior infants and first class. We went to a range of different schools, urban, rural, mixed, single sex, to get a proper level and to not distinguish just to one type of school.
So the way that we went about carrying out these surveys is we created 6 tests, 6 surveys, questions. Now, the problem as well, of course, that we had to overcome was that because the students are only the ages of 5 to 7, we had to change our surveys to make sure that they were appropriate for students of this age. We had to make sure they were very visual and that the students understood what was being asked of them. So the first of our survey questions was the toy test. So we gave the students an option of 3 different toys. They could choose a doll, a jigsaw, or a digger. And we wanted to see which the students would want to play with the most. So they could choose only one toy in which they wanted to play with the most. The results we found to this were absolutely staggering. Of every single boy that we tested, only 4 chose the doll. And of every single girl we tested, only 1 chose the digger. This shows us that, however, the gender neutral toy we put there was a jigsaw. And we found that both boys and girls were leaning towards this as well. So the number 1 conclusion that we drew from this was that boys are willing to play with traditionally viewed male toys and gender-friendly toys. However, they are not wanting to swap and play with the gender, with the toy that matches the opposite gender. And the same is true for the girls. And we think that this is a serious issue because toys that are traditionally viewed as girl toys really help with building students, building their social skills, and they're very agentic. We found as well that with the boy toys, traditionally viewed boy toys, they help with critical thinking. Another test that we carried out was about subjects, and this is something that we were really happily surprised by. So we asked the students how much they liked the subjects of English, art, science, and maths, just to see if they really liked it or didn't like them at all. And we were delighted to find out that both boys and girls really, really love all the subjects that we asked them. But then this made us think as well, there's something happening from the ages of 5 to 7 to the ages of 15 to 17 that is creating a huge gender divide between this. Because at 5 to 7, both boys and girls are loving all subjects, including science and maths. But when we get to the ages of 15 to 17, there's a huge drop off in this. Another survey question we gave the students was we asked them to simply draw a picture of an engineer. They could draw any engineer they wanted, and then we asked them to give their engineer a name to see if they were naming them boy names or girl names. And what we found again was that the boys were, that 96% of boys drew a male engineer. So boys can only see an engineer as a male, whereas 56% of girls drew an engineer as a male. So girls are not limiting themselves. Well, no, what we found is that the girls were more limiting of their own ability than the boys. The boys thought that the boys would be fantastic engineers, but the girls would not. Whereas the girls thought that both boys and girls would be fantastic engineers. So based on this, we think that it's very important that, yes, it's important to keep initiatives in place to help girls get interested in STEM, but it's also equally important to get boys in, to educate boys and to change their attitudes towards what boys and girls can do.
And then that brings us on to our last survey question. We asked them what job would they like when they're older, and we got a variety of different. There was a beekeeper, there was a priest, I think there was an astronaut as well. So there's definitely high hopes for the future generations. But one of the main results we got is 15% of all boys and girls said they would like to be a teacher. And this shows that they were the teacher 6-7 hours a day for a lot of the year. So the teachers have a massive impact on them. School has a massive impact on how they think. So what we decided to do is develop a resource kit to help combat gender stereotyping specifically for in schools. So we created a teacher checklist for teachers to be aware of what they do in the classroom. Because you might have a teacher, not meaningfully, but just subconsciously asking, oh, can I have 3 strong lads to lift this table here? They're not going out trying to be gender stereotypical, but it's just subconscious. So that we're trying to make them aware of what they're doing in the classroom to help banish these gender stereotypes. We also created a jingle based on some of the results from a question we asked them about emotions, to help them to show boys and girls that it's okay to show emotions, and when they feel those emotions that they can tell people and how to show them.
So what's next for our project? Well, unfortunately, due to the lockdown and the pandemic, we were unable to go to Spain to carry out the European round of the Young Scientists, but hopefully next year we will get to do this. We would also have liked to extend our project. What we would have liked to have done is to look and see exactly what is the difference between the impact of being in a single sex school versus a mixed school, and does the impact of girls being with boys change how the boys' attitude in the classroom. But unfortunately, we were unable to do this because of the lockdown, but hopefully in the coming year we will be able to go out and do this. What we believe is that it's very important that, yes, while the initiatives stay in place to try getting girls more interested in STEM, we think it's equally important to create positive, to find positive role models and to try change the attitude of boys at this young age. We are delighted that our project that we managed to win the competition, because I think it's such an important topic, and we were so happy to shine light on the topic. And more importantly, we were happy to be able to give these young children a voice, because this is something that is not easily done when students are only 5 to 7. We were delighted to be able to give them a voice, and so that they can be heard on such an important topic. So thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cormac, and thank you, Alan, for that. And that was really interesting. And to all you guys listening in on the Zoom call, I mean, get your questions in, and I'll put as many of them as I can to the two guys. And their presentation, I think, segues nicely into our next one, which is from Anne Looney at DCU, and you know, around the whole issue of education. So I'll hand over to you, Anne. And you're just on mute there, Anne, so you might take yourself off.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Alan and Cormac. That was really interesting, and also a model presentation on how to present research findings and keep your audience engaged. So well done there. So what as Mark has said, I'm the Dean of the Institute of Education at DCU. So we have 4,000 education students here, and that would be people preparing to work in early years, people preparing to teach in a primary school, teach in a post-primary school, work in a further education setting, and we have graduate students and researchers from around the world as well. So there's a lot of education stuff that would normally be going on the campus here in Drumcondra. Now, obviously, people are dispersed to the four winds, but I want to focus attention in this presentation on the early years. And it's not to say that I don't think what happens in schools is important. It's actually that I think it's too late. We now know in Ireland that we have almost 95% of our 3-year-olds are now in their ECHE setting, their early years, their preschool year that every 3-year-old is now entitled to. And what's happening there and what's happening before children ever get to school is actually critical in the formation of gender stereotypes. And while schools can, using things like Alan and Cormac's checklist for teachers and other resources, while they can do a lot, actually the stereotypes are formed before the children ever come into a classroom. And I want to take you to another piece of research that was conducted in a science museum in the United States, where researchers asked participants to allow themselves to be recorded while they explained the exhibits to their children. And the researchers were interested in the father talk. So Mark, right up the ponytail story there, right? So they were interested in the dad talk. So when they were going around the various exhibits in the Science Museum, how did fathers present what was in front of them to their children? And the researchers were interested in the science aspect about it, but boy, when the results came in, did the whole attention focus on gender. So at their very youngest children, when dads were standing in front of exhibits about gravity or magnetism or pressure, boys were treated to descriptions about the action, the science, the consequences of what was being exhibited, how it was used in real life. Girls were treated to description about the color, the space, the shape, the smell, the fun. And initially the researchers were kind of completely taken aback by these differences. So they reran the study, this time with a focus in particular on those differences. And they were compounded in the second run of the study. So there was a very different way that dads had in speaking to their daughters than in speaking to their sons around the sciences. And there are lots of similar studies now in the early years that would say that what Alan and Cormac found about the digger versus doll is not caused by Smith's toy stores, pink and black aisles, but is in fact a result of parental talk. Very early in children's years. So we're really conscious of working with our early years educators here on the Drumcondra campus around how they work with parents, in particular around the talk that children hear and the language that they hear. Because Alan and Cormac are right. Their research is borne out by lots of other studies that say that at that around the ages of 5 to 7, when it comes to subjects and things that children like in school, they're pretty gender blind. Science, maths, art, PE, likes have to do with a whole range of things, but you don't see a great gender differences. The gender differences around STEM show up around the ages of 9. And 2 things happen at the age of 9 in schools. Children divide into children who really like maths and science and begin to articulate a preference for that area and to articulate a lack of ability in it. So children start saying, I can't do maths around about the age of 9. And they until then, they still think they can try. And gender differences start to appear. And of course, around about the age of 9, you begin to start developing more complex gender identities. So there's something very interesting that happens at upper primary that we're really interested here in DCU as well, and hope to conduct some research on as well. When it comes to teachers, we do work with all our teachers and early years educators on being conscious of gender stereotyping. And we use things like checklists. We help teachers to be aware of the materials they're selecting from classroom use. And as many of you will know, I used to lead the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, and we were really conscious of working with textbook developers and with the curriculum of moving beyond the curriculum I did in school, which was the dead white male, approach to literature, for example, to give people a wider range of experiences. But I suppose my key message today is the limitations of what schools can do. They can do a lot, and we should be asking them to do more. But actually, we really need to focus attention on our very youngest citizens. If we really want to tackle gender stereotyping in the workplace, and we want to look at the workplace of the future, then we've got to start with the children who are under 5 before they get to school.
Thank you very much for that, Anne. That was really, really interesting. And now I'll bring you to Karen Boyle, who has a particular expertise on gender stereotyping in the media. And I'm sure we'll have some interesting questions for Karen as well. And any questions you have for Anne, don't be afraid to send them through. So thanks very much. So I'll hand you over to Karen now. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Mark. I first of all just want to say thanks to the last 2 speakers, and or 3 speakers, I should say. And Alan and Cormac, you might be interested to know, I have been running this year a course on gender representation in the media, a massive open online course. It's had learners from 140 countries. And on the week on stereotyping, when people were asked to share examples of good and bad practice, quite a number of people were sharing news stories about your project. So it had quite a good international audience in that sense. So it's really nice to hear a bit more about it. And I want to pick up on kind of what I think's been running through both the last presentations, which is this idea in a way that you can't be what you can't see. And I want to talk about that in relation to the media. It's not going to surprise you to know that I'm going to do that. But in a way, part of what I want to do is encourage us not just to think of the media, if you like, as the bad guys in this, but actually to think as well about all of us as media consumers, but also increasingly as media makers and contributors of one kind or another, whether that's corporate communications or our personal social media. So stereotypes work because they reduce a group to a set of characteristics and ask us to think about them in broad brushstrokes rather than as complex individuals. And the dominant group in society is not on the whole stereotyped as a group. So we've heard that a bit already. You don't tend to talk about middle-class straight white men as a group. Instead, you might talk about engineers or CEOs, or they're seen in different kinds of categories. So that's partly because we've got so many different versions of that group in circulation that stereotyping becomes meaningless because there's so much evidence to the contrary, right? So one reason stereotypes of marginalized groups work is because they're marginalized in representation. So we don't see or hear marginalized groups enough, so it's easier to think of them collectively and only representing the category to which they belong. Now, there's a quote I've used in a couple of classes and teaching exercises from Baroness Worsey that I think speaks to this really nicely when she talks about representations of British Muslim women. And it's in a context of talking about the fact that British Muslim women in the news are typically there to speak about the hijab, or they're there to speak about being British Muslim women. And she says that being able to tell the ordinary bits of our stories is in itself, well, extraordinary. So not to talk about being that identity, but to talk about your role as a parent, or your role as an engineer, or your role in those kind of different aspects. So if we want to think about expanding visibility, it's really important we've got an evidence base to build on. So where are different groups within our media? And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples relating to news, although there's also lots of studies that look at fiction and other forms of entertainment. But if we take news, there's a large project called the Global Media Monitoring Project that looks at the position of women in the news globally every 5 years. We're in the middle of the study now, so I can't give you the 2020 figures. But the last time this study was run in 2015, it found that globally 24% of people in the news were women. But when you drill down into specific types of stories, that number changes. So for instance, globally, 16% of people in politics and government news were women. And that, believe it or not, is a considerable improvement on when the study started in 1995, when it was only 7%. But there's clearly still a long way to go. And I think the thing that's important there is when I've run the Scottish part of this study, and when I've looked at it relative to representation in our own, in our own politics. So obviously we have a female First Minister, and we did at the time this study ran the last time. Indeed, at the time the study ran last time, the heads of opposition were also female. And yet the representation of women in the media in that case really lagged behind the representation of women in Parliament. So the first thing we need to do, and we've heard that already, is notice it's a problem. And education is really, really important in that. But I think we need to really be alert to the fact it's not just the formal education system. We need to think about what can we do in our workplaces, in our homes, in our communities. And when we're thinking about how to address it, in workplace terms, it can be about expanding the range of people at tables making the decisions, but also thinking about how you shape the media landscape. Who are your spokespeople? What training do they receive? What expectations are placed on employees in terms of social media participation or promotion? And how equitable are these? How would your internal communications fare if subject to the kind of analysis that the Global Media Monitoring Project performs on newspapers and television news and radio? Now, Sonia asked us at the beginning to challenge ourselves, and I'd extend that to challenge ourselves as media consumers. If you're engaging with mainstream media and feel they're not delivering what they should be, what are you going to do about it? Where can you feed back? How can you feed back? But also, where else can you look? What are maybe alternative sources of news? How can you expand your own worldview in that sense? So I'm sure there's lots of issues we're going to pick up on questions, and I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that. Thank you very much indeed. So look, I'll pile in with a few questions. I have a few of my own first to get started with, and I'll try and put a couple of questions to the two lads from Cork, and then a couple down, and then a couple to Karen, and then any questions that you guys send in, I'll bounce them in whatever direction they are due. But for Cormac and Alan down there in the Deputy Principal's office, can I just ask you, just since you won the Young Scientist competition in January, have you had any further engagement since then with any politicians or with any with anybody who would have been there on the day? Have they asked to see your research more, or have they acted on it in any way, or have they shown any further interest in it since January?
Yeah, I suppose, well, obviously we weren't able to further our project by going back to schools because of coronavirus, but we were able to actually go to the Citizen Assembly at the start of the year.
Okay.
This year the theme was on gender equality, so we were able to do that and have an interview. So that was really, really good for our project as well, and to get exposure as well. We're also going around to different businesses as well, such as Dell, EMC. We were at the CSO as well. So there's definitely been an interest from government agencies and business as well. So we've definitely.
So that's good. So your research, I mean, the value and the good of it didn't just end in January when you won the award. I mean, it's something that you're taking forward and trying to achieve more with. And can I just ask you guys as well, in terms of, I mean, Anne pointed out that you know, it's parents in a way, almost preschool, who are responsible for a lot of the initial gender stereotyping. But that doesn't mean we still don't have to engage with young people. How for old idiots like me in trying to engage with younger people, do you have any advice or practical advice for people like me in terms of engaging with younger people in gender stereotyping without, I suppose, turning them off or without turning it into a sort of a boring adult conversation? Is there a way of engaging and keeping it lively?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I think it's more about, you know, just to shine a light on it. I think that definitely our generation, we feel, is more aware to it. And, you know, I mean, because there's so many initiatives that have already been put in place, I mean, like definitely our age is more prone to it. And we believe our project as well was definitely the right project at the right time. We mean, like, the fact that, I mean, if you think back about 20 years ago, the chance of our project being entered or the project winning was much lower. But we think, yeah, to talk to students about it, we think, you know, obviously, if you're looking for just to raise awareness of gender stereotyping, obviously we believe, you know, social media is a great way to get the attention of young people these days. And, you know, we think it's important as well to listen to what they have to say and to listen to what young people have to say and to try giving them a voice in this time as well. Because, I mean, sometimes people are forgotten, or, you know, it's hard to take the voice of younger people as well. You know, as well, of course, it's great that there are initiatives in place, but we strongly believe, you know, more initiatives need to be done, more needs to be more important, you know, and as well, of course, nowadays it's more important than ever to get, you know, students interested in STEM, because, you know, but I think as well it's important that yeah, you do just, you know, listen to them and just getting to them in any way that you can.
Yeah, and I think when dealing with younger people, if you're an older person like me, I think listening is always a good place to start. And just one other question for you guys. I'm particularly interested in this resource kit that you come up with as part of your project, because as part of the WorkEqual campaign, the campaign is very interested in, I suppose, practical measures and that people and businesses and organizations can take. Just talk me through that resource kit and the teacher checklist and what was in it. Just give me a little bit more color on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose one of the main things was the teacher checklist that I mentioned earlier, just to make teachers aware of, so that they have in their classroom, they have books portraying girls in traditionally viewed male roles and vice versa. So books and films on that. Also to be aware of what they're doing in the classroom. Obviously the jingle as well is a big thing, and we also have a website as well, because obviously in today's world everything is online. So we're obviously in the development of the project still, so we're not able to make that public, but that has all our resources on it. And we also have books. So there's Rosie Revere, the engineer. It's the story of a young girl, and everyone tells her, oh, she wants to be an engineer, and they're like, oh, you're a girl, you can't be an engineer. But then her grandmother tells her, you can be whatever you want, and then she goes on to lead a life to be an amazing engineer. So it's books like that to show young people that you can do this, because when they're that young, what they see is what they believe. So if they can see that there's girls being engineers or astronauts, then that will lead them, yes, I can do this. Whereas if they're not seeing that and they're only seeing girls in traditionally viewed female jobs, that's just going to stay the same.
And of course, as well, something that we would have loved to have been able to do as well is if we could have gone back to the schools that we'd previously gone to and given them the resource kit and asked them to implement it for a period of maybe 6 months or up to a year. And then we come back again and we redo the survey with them to see if it has in fact had an impact on them. But of course, we've been limited in what we can and can't do, especially with going back into schools.
Thanks for that, guys. Thank you very much. Anne, if I could just turn to you for a moment, and you said, and something that stood out for me in your presentation, you said that and by the time kids get to school, it's too late. Almost that a lot of the gender stereotyping has already been embedded by the parents, I suppose, and by adults in the children's lives. How could the adults be reached, I suppose, in a sense? How can we reach parents to remind them of their responsibilities when parenting their children in relation to gender stereotyping before they get to school? What's the best way to do that without, I suppose, patronizing parents almost to a certain way?
Yeah, and obviously parents, you know, they go to school, so schools definitely do have a role there as well. But I think that I really think that the early childhood settings can be significant here, because the early years settings, and Ireland is just, you know, starting off to, you know, we're 10 years in developing our early years education system. There's a long way to go, and there are significant issues with the early years workforce as well. Men are very underrepresented in the early years workforce, and that has to do a lot with pay and conditions in that setting as well. Mm-hmm. But children, when parents bring a child to an early years setting, whether that's a creche or playgroup, they're incredibly interested in how the child is going to play. Lots of parents will connect up to apps and look for pictures and updates. What were they doing? The little journals that you get home telling you what your child was doing. And there's a real opportunity there to, you know, to make sure the girls get the diggers, to make sure that the stereotypes of the pink corner and the blue corner are challenged in the early years setting and in those conversations with parents and how parents are brought in. And many Irish early years settings are really championing this now, especially around outdoor play and bringing the community in and working with local organisations from farming to fire brigades around challenging those and involving the parents in that can really help the parents begin to ask questions again. But as parents have said to me, it works very well, you know, in our circle of conversation. But then when we move out and we go to the children's party or we go to the library, it becomes really hard to sustain. So it really needs to be a whole of system agenda. And it's easy to forget because we're so concerned about so many other issues to forget the gender stereotyping one. It hasn't gone away.
And just going back to something that Cormac and Alan refer to, they refer to with their teacher's checklist, I suppose, reminding teachers, you know, I mean, if you have a teacher who needs a table move, not saying something like, I need 3 strong lads. How do you, I suppose, sieve gender stereotyping out of teachers in their training? And are they bringing their own biases and their own view of stereotypes into the classroom? And is there also a problem in the curriculum and in books? I mean, when you're training teachers, how do you try and address that issue?
So we'd certainly make all our teachers aware about the selection of materials. And I think it's fair to say the primary school curriculum in the 99 curriculum and the new framework is very conscious of addressing and challenging stereotypes and giving children the tools to call out stereotypes. I think that's really important. It's not about just saving the children from gender stereotypes, it's actually making them active participants in challenging gender stereotyping, so that if a teacher says, I need 3 strong lads to lift a table, that actually a child in the classroom could say, you know, teacher, you know, girls can be strong too, or whatever they might want to say. So it's also about teaching children to speak up. But I think when we look at our teacher workforce, so on average intake for us, because we've been, you know, working hard to recruit males into the teaching profession, about 20% of them of our primary teachers would be, trainee teachers would be male. It would go up to about 40% of our post-primary teachers would be male. Relative to international patterns, that's not a bad gender breakdown in terms of balance, and it's certainly going in the right direction. I think we have to work with our teachers to give them the tools. We also have to make them sensitive in their own worlds and in their own circles. And quite a lot of those who come into primary teaching come from quite a middle class background. They tend to be successful at school. So very often they can need a bit of a shake up. And in the course of their 4 years with us, because they go to work in different kinds of schools, because we expose them to different kinds of experience, and we give them some of the theories that Karen has spoken about, you know, what is a stereotype, how is it challenged? We try to do that for them and with them, but it's something that we hope then they would keep going throughout their career, because it's not something you train as a young person. And sometimes as a young person, you know, you're not conscious of it yourself until you begin to move into the workplace and you look at who's being promoted and who's your head teacher and who's your principal, and then maybe some of the issues arise for you as well.
Karen, as a journalist, I'm particularly interested in this news monitoring project that you've been involved in. And I suppose one of the things about journalism is that, you know, in its purest form, news journalism is about really just being a mirror to society rather than trying to shape it. So I just wanted to just ask you about, you know, representations of women in news media, and if there's only, you know, if women are only 1 in 5 of CEOs or 1 in 12 of CEOs of FTSE 100 companies or whatever, shouldn't the coverage reflect that, or should news media actually try and use positive bias and to push women to the front line?
I think that's an interesting question, but I mean, if you look at the point about, partly it's also about news values. So if you look at something like the Global Media Monitoring Project and even take up that point about we should reflect the world. Well, last I heard, women weren't 24% of the population of the world, but yet they're 24% of the people in the news. So either that's telling you something about what's valued as news, or it's telling you something about bias, or it's maybe telling you something about both, which I think is probably the answer. In terms of positive reaching out, I mean, I think the Scottish example that we had from the last time we did the project was really interesting. So politics and government news, which does tend to skew towards focusing on leaders in particular, which we know, and obviously there's only a small number of leaders, so there's always going to be a bias there. But we had female leaders, and yet the politics and government news was still overwhelmingly male. And what that suggested to us was that people were reaching out, even though the political landscape was changing. If you like, in some ways, the list of contacts that people reached out for as the first point maybe wasn't. And what we've found kind of repeatedly in these things is that sense that people reach for the people like them. So we've got to change who's in the newsroom in the first place in terms of then expanding that. But also some other projects I've been involved in are really about thinking about, you know, how do we make that easier for journalists, particularly understanding the quite pressured conditions journalists are often working under at the moment. And, you know, one of the things there, so at the moment, I'm involved in a project with Women 50/50 and in Gender, which is the Scottish women's rights organisation, called Pass the Mic, which is specifically looking at the representation of women of colour in the Scottish media. So we're just about to undertake a media monitoring project, and we're going to use that. There's a number of media partners who we're working with to kind of say to them, look, this is what we found in your organisation. What are you going to do about it, as one thing? But the other thing is our partners in this are working, providing training for women of colour, trying to encourage them to put themselves forward as spokespeople. But then that's also why we can't just think of the media in isolation, because you're saying, for instance, oh, if the CEOs are X%, but actually it's very rarely the CEOs who are speaking. It's usually spokespeople for the organisations. So organisations can take these kind of proactive views and think about, okay, who are we putting forward? Who have we given the training to be comfortable to speak on the media? And just one other kind of slightly flip example about this, but one area that's often bemoaned is things like panel shows, right? Be it comedy or question time. And nearly always when you try to have conversations with media makers about this, they'll say, but when we went to the Labour Party, the person who was available that week was a man, or when we went to, you know, the Conservative Party, the person who was available was a man. But what if they were saying, well, okay, well, you can either find us a woman or you can't have a place at the table? You know, what if they're saying, right, okay, we're going to come to you every week, but over the course of the next 12 weeks of the run of the programme, 6 of the people you put forward have to be women, otherwise you don't have a place at the table. There's different ways of doing things that are not all about the media being the ones to have to do it, but asking the organisations that are represented in the media to think about their own practice, because often it's not even, it's not willful, it's just.
And do you think, Karen, that in terms of perpetuating gender stereotypes in the media, who's the biggest sinner? Is it editorial journalists, or is it the commercial advertising trying to sell people products end of things? Which if that's not too difficult or too binary a question.
It's maybe telling that what came to mind as soon as you said that was Donald Trump, but maybe that's just the kind of the position we're in right now. But I suppose, although I say that in a flip way, I suppose part of what I'm thinking there is that actually we've all got that kind of responsibility for what the media discourse is. And okay, Trump's a very particular figure who's got a profile, but who are we all retweeting? Who are we responding to? I think we're all involved in this process. And that's what gives me hope, because I think if we're all involved, it means we can all be part of the change. In terms of the actual structural things in news organisations and so on, I think it's always got to be a two-way conversation. It's not pointing the finger and saying the media are getting this wrong. It's saying we want to tell the stories that represent the communities that we're based in. So how do we work together with those communities to ensure we're telling all those stories? So I think it's got to be a two-way conversation.
And just bringing in some questions now from people listening in, and I'll stay with you for a moment, Karen. There's a question here from Karen Proudfoot, and she's talking about sports media, and she's talking about the Sunday Times finally published an article last Sunday where a woman commented that there was only one column dedicated to women's sport. It was a 24-page sports supplement. Is sports media and that kind of thing, is that's a real that's a real area where the media could really improve, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's going back to your last question, that's one of those that's quite difficult to untangle, because there's always then the claim, yes, but men's football's better and we want to watch men's football because it's better, or men's football has got more sponsorship and therefore it's got more profile. And so it becomes quite difficult to disentangle. In Scotland, it is, it's not even really sport, it's just, 15 pages at the back of the paper about Rangers and Celtic. And that's pretty difficult to break into. The media monitoring project that I'm doing at the moment, we actually just looked through the Scottish papers on Monday, and there was one of them, there was not a single woman in the sports section, not a single woman.
Not a single one.
So sports media have got a long way to go. Just an aside there, one of the things I think has been really, really interesting during the lockdown and kind of the way that professional sport has started up afterwards, because they're less based on physical audiences, live audiences in the space. Women's, I'm thinking specifically about football, but in the UK, women's football is getting more of a national profile, BBC One and so on, partly because there being no crowd is a bit of an equaliser.
Yeah, and you notice as well, I mean, I noticed in some of the language usage by journalists in covering women's football, they don't say the England women's football team anymore, and they just say England won 2-0 or England beat Brazil 2-0 or
the
whatever.
flip side to that was I did see an article this week that talked about the men's team, which made me very happy.
Well, there you go. Well, that's progress. Look, I'm going to start moving through a couple more of the audience questions, and I'm going to make them a little bit more rapid fire. I'll just have my eye on the clock here. So I want to go back to Alan and Cormac there for a minute. They're asking, one person listening in is asking, did the mix of jobs that the kids wanted to have when they grew up align with the gender stereotypes? I mean, I suppose what they're asking is, were the children that you dealt with, or did you get a chance to talk to them about this, were they aspiring towards gender stereotype roles, I think?
I suppose to an extent they were, but there wasn't like a massive gap. But actually with the teachers, it was more an even kind of 50-50 split between, there was a lot of boys and a lot of girls felt like being a teacher. So I suppose that kind of brings it back to like that what they see is what they want to be. So at that age, they haven't seen a lot of jobs, and the teacher is a massive role in their lives. So I suppose that's probably why it's a bigger percentage. And as they get older, it probably changes, but at that age, majority was teachers.
Okay, so there was a question here for Anne as well, and this question is from Anna Fitzgerald, and she just wanted to ask you, Anne, if how mothers explain the science exhibits, how did that compare to how fathers explained it, and was there a difference there, and sort of, can you just give us a little bit more on that?
So the study focused on fathers. It's a study. I put it's by Maureen Callanan at the University of Santa Cruz, who's done all of this work about how parents explain science to children. So there are lots of different studies there. Because the study was of fathers and the gender finding was a surprise, they only studied fathers, but she's doing further work this year. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out in it. Watch that space. University of Santa Cruz is leading on this, and we hope to connect up with them. Sinead McNally at my own institution works with Maureen on a few of those studies, and we have an SFI funded research project on maths talk in early years in school, where we're listening to how teachers describe mathematical concepts and looking at gendered language there. And I think that would be an interesting to do some of that study in an Irish context.
And could I just ask you as well, and another question that has come in here from somebody listening in, it's about single-sex schools, and does that help to perpetuate stereotypes by offering boys and girls sort of different or more limited subjects, and what sort of an impact does single-sex schools have on this whole notion of gender stereotyping?
So single, if anyone has lived abroad, they'll know that single-sex schools are becoming a rarer commodity, and in an Irish context, they tend to be older schools. What's really interesting is that girls in single-sex schools have a much wider subject choice than girls in coeducational schools. Because guess what happens in coeducational schools is that home economics is put against materials, technology, wood. So what is the message there, folks? Whereas in single-sex girls' schools that offer woodwork, and there are single-sex girls' schools that do offer that, it's open to anybody. Equally, there are single-sex boys' schools successfully offering home economics. And they get a huge uptake in home economics, much more than they do in the coeducational schools. Discuss. I mean, it's so clear that obviously there are social processes happening in the coeducational setting that are actually messaging the kids that this subject is not for you. Whereas when it's on offer in a single-sex schools, the clear message is this subject is for all. So there's some very interesting dynamics in single-sex education around subject choice that you might be surprised about.
And just on that note, I mean, I see a comment here from Claire Looney on our Zoom group
No
chat.
No relation.
Where she talks about, she says she's a female engineer and she attended a single-sex school, and it was a surprise when she got to university and there were only 15% females in the class. She said I hadn't really been brought to her attention, and she just chose a course that she liked. If I can just go back to you, Karen, in terms of, and this sort of touches again on and the point that I have been making about sort of positive bias and whatever, and the impact of that, and just talk to me a little bit more about how you think that could help news journalism. I mean, to give you an example, I'm not just a columnist. I often do a lot of interviews and one-on-one set piece interviews. And I can tell you, like we go out of our way to try and find women in very, very senior positions to do interviews with. And it can be more difficult sometimes to do, but we try and put the effort into doing it, but we don't always get up to 50%. How important is positive bias in the media for addressing these issues?
Two things I think I'll say about that. First, there's a great quote that again is one of those I feel like I trot out every time I speak, but is that changes in representation don't only follow on from changes in reality, they can also lead the way. So I think that is a really useful kind of reminder to us all. And I think we've heard that in educational contexts, for instance, today. The other thing I'd say in response to the point about we try to get women. I mean, I think there are genuine problems here, and part of it's expanding the range of people we ask, but also it's about thinking about what are the costs to women of media visibility, or not just women, but actually particular groups. It's certainly true for particularly, for instance, if you look at something like the abuse on social media, that politicians get when they speak out in the media. When Amnesty International did a study of abuse aimed at UK politicians in 2017, spanning 6 months, nearly 50% of the abuse of all politicians was aimed at Diane Abbott, one person, one Black woman. So you've got to think, and that's why I'm sort of also putting the onus back on media organisations, but not just media organisations, political parties, businesses, universities. What training are you giving people to engage with the media? And not just that, but if you want people in your organisation to speak on behalf of your organisation, have you got their back? And do they know you've got your back? Because there's some of us that if we occupy a public platform, we're going to get backlash, we're going to get pushback. So who's got our back? And I think that's a really important question. And I've seen that in all kinds of contexts, not just the kind of high profile people who might be speaking in relation to being expert on something. But for instance, other work I've done around violence in particular, and what are the costs to survivors of speaking in the media, for instance, and who's got their back. And that's why I'd always say that, you know, really an ethical approach to, say, working with survivors is to go through gatekeeper organisations so that those organisations have got their backs.
Okay, and just really quickly before I bring in Michelle Miller, just one last quick one for you, Karen, and it's just in relation. I know you've done a lot of work around gender and stereotyping and bias around elections and the coverage of elections and so on. You've done some work there with Kamala Harris running for vice president now in the United States. Do you think that the sort of gender, have you noticed yourself personally that she's stereotyped in the way that female politicians often are, you know, references to how they dress and so on? And do you think, you know, having somebody like Kamala Harris running and hopefully entering the White House at some stage, will that have a positive impact on media coverage, do you think, and how to cover these things?
I mean, it's the stuff on women politicians is quite contradictory. I mean, we did see that in the UK at the last general election, that a number of female politicians stood down, citing the abuse they received online and kind of negative media attention as part of the reason. And those kind of stories in themselves become part of the reason other women select out of politics. So again, that's why I come back to the point that visibility is important, but it's not the end goal, because if being visible makes you vulnerable, who's got your back and whose responsibility is that? So in relation to Kamala Harris, you know, fingers crossed, I'm not going to pretend I'm neutral in this. Fingers crossed we see her in the White House. Yes, actually, fingers crossed we do see her in the White House. That's not even what I meant, but wherever the other house is. But, you know, yes, she's, to be honest, in terms of what I've seen in UK media, she's barely figured. You know, I mean, there's not been the same kind of coverage. But yeah, we do. I mean, what the case we had most recently in Scottish media was a horrendous Scotland, Daily Mail in Scotland, front page during the Brexit negotiations that was of Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon. I don't know if any of you saw this, but it was never mind Brexit, who won Lexit. Yes. And when that's the kind of level of political commentary, you know, even if it's not explicit abuse, this kind of jokey nudge, nudge, wink, wink, it doesn't exactly make you feel like you're being taken seriously.
Yeah, it's I think maybe perhaps part of the culture of that particular newspaper to approach things in that way. Professor Michelle Miller, if I can just bring you in there really quick, you're the advisor to the WorkEqual campaign. What's your initial reaction? I mean, we've discussed a lot of issues here today, you know, sort of early addressing stereotyping in early childcare, at school, in the media, in politics. What's your initial takeaway, your initial reaction, and what stood out for you in today's presentation?
Thanks, Mark. I think today's been overwhelmingly positive and refreshing. Even going back to our first speakers, Alan and Cormac, and their natural curiosity and where it led to, you know, the phenomena that they could see occurring in front of them. And the future looks very bright with people like Alan and Cormac in our society, that they're asking those questions. I think it's fantastic. And then to listen to Anne and how refreshing it was to hear about, you know, the efforts that are being made with our students that are involved in teacher training, you know, that it is being called out. And it led on to the wider part then in terms of Karen. And really, I don't mean to sound like the COVID ad, but it's in our hands. It's all of us as parents, as teachers, as educators, as aunties, as uncles, as friends. You know, we need Alan and Cormac's checklist and think, you know, no more. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Mark, but in terms of, you know, your daughter and the daddy tale, you know, but for all of us, it's around us. And, you know, with Karen, that we need to be, we are consumers of the media, that, you know, I'm very much filled with hope. We've a lot to learn. I think that, yes, we do need, you know, more guidance in terms of broadcasting and codes of conducts and all of that. But really, it's in our hands, and we have to check our own unconscious bias in what we do as individuals, organizations, and government. So I think it's been a fantastic session and a great start to the series. So
thank you very much, Michelle, for that. And I'll bear in mind what you say around the daddy tale. Maybe if you really wanted to help me there, you could, you know, point me towards a YouTube tutorial or something on how to do a proper ponytail. Look, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. And just a couple of people to thank. I want to thank Sonia Lennon and the WorkEqual team and everybody at WorkEqual, including the Alice PR and events team, who behind the scenes have been making sure everything goes smoothly. And thanks, of course, to Michelle. I want to thank our panelists, the two lads from Cork, Cormac and Alan, and Anne and Karen in Glasgow. A big thank you to our sponsors, the state training agency Solus and Permanent TSB. And most of all, thank you to all you guys for tuning in, to our attendees today. And this, as Sonia has said, this is just the first of 5 of these series this month, the solution series. Next one is Monday lunchtime, and then I think it's the 3 Thursdays after that. And you can get more details on workequal.ie. Well, listen, I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we'll get to chat to you guys again in future. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.